This week on the Woven Energy podcast.
The Evenki people call themselves Evenk, which means people. So where you can imagine the old Victorian anthropologists going along say, "Who are you?" "We're people." yeah, but who are you? "Well, we're people." They really care about their India. You know, we were talking about animists having a reverence for nature and a reverence for animals and animal spirits. They are so close to their India. It's us that creates this idea of the god, in inverted commas, of thunder, because we, frankly, invented this god idea, you know. Basically, they had these guys who used to stand lookout, and whenever the priests they saw priests approaching, they would run into their little chapel and all start praying.
Quick, get the crosses out.
So then what we've got is a massive mismatch between our genetics and our culture. Very briefly, one of the things that's always frustrated me with martial arts is this idea of belts. I think at this point in my life, I think they're one of the most pointless inventions ever.
If you could talk a little bit about the Evenki people and their shamanism.
Well, everything you hear about shamanism, everything you hear about animism, it's in abundance among the Evenki people, in absolute abundance. I don't think there's anything that we've talked about on any of the podcasts to date that you wouldn't find going on somewhere in their society.
Hey guys, and welcome to the Woven Energy podcast with me, Joseph Sikora, and Damon Smith. As always, we're here to talk about shamanism from the ground up. So, animism. We're on that topic right now, and I have to say that the last episode on animism was a real eye-opener for me personally. It sort of cemented for me what animism really is holistically, and it highlighted a main problem for me that I've had personally, and for most people, I think. And that is words and labels and the preconceived ideas that we perhaps have about animism. The fact that we use this label animism immediately forces concepts and preconceived ideas onto it. Hence the belief that spirits inhabit rocks and plants and trees, etc., etc. Animists just get on with their lives and don't think of themselves as animists. It's us looking from the outside in who've placed this label on them and constructed an idea of what and who they are based on the cultural lens that we view them through. We, as civilized people living in a civilized world, have beliefs, so why shouldn't they? Animism is our hook into the natural world, or into nature. It's the hold we have on the environmental niche of our species, which is essential, not the word was, it was essential to our survival. Like the goshawk flying through the undergrowth at breakneck speeds needs to hold onto the tapestry of its surroundings, or it breaks its neck on a branch, or the pride of lions that work as a team, a fairly smart team actually, to bring down very large and dangerous prey. The important thing is that these animals don't think we need to work as a team, or, whoa, there's a branch and I need to move to the left. It doesn't think. It holds on to the weave of its surroundings. It just knows because nature has been present in its life and has guided and nurtured it and instilled those core survival modes into its instinct. That's animism, that hook into the woven energy of the natural world, which is, by the way, where the name woven energy comes from. And I think this concept is lost on us, most of us anyway today, because we simply don't need it anymore. But reconnecting with our place in nature, our niche, is surely a good place to start if we want to understand ourselves as human beings and our place in this world. And I don't mean going off and living the hunter-gatherer life, but letting that aspect of our natural birthright colour the way we perceive the world, the way we act, the way we connect with others, and bring that into the world we find ourselves in, with our eyes slightly more open and our holes slightly more filled, I guess. Getting personal a bit, this is something which means a lot to me because I struggled and to be honest, still do struggle with this, particularly with thinking and rationalising too much, which is what animism isn't about. One thing from doing these podcasts with Damon, and you know I am still very much the student myself, is that I'm seeing the world slightly differently to how I used to. I'm seeing this bias for the lower world, you know, our constant need to analyse and rationalise. I'm seeing that a lot more clearly, and we just seem to be driving ourselves nuts as a species. I sometimes get clear insights now and glimpses into this animistic world. They happen now and again, and it's like, after a big intense workout and you go, and breathe, relax. That's kind of how it feels sometimes. So I want to really drive the concept of animism home a little more with this episode and have a look at the different stages we find animistic groups or tribes in, and then relate that and go in depth with one in particular, which I know Damon knows a lot about and wants to talk about, which is the Evenks, the Evenki people of Siberia, who actually use the language where the word shaman comes from, the language that they speak. So, Damon, my introduction to animism, is that hitting it home, or is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. You mentioned in the context of the Evenki people, you mentioned that animists don't go around thinking that they're animists. I think I might have mentioned that in a previous podcast or two as well. What we used to call the Evenki people are the Tungus people. And Tungus, if you recall, a while back we talked about the Yakut, another group of people from Siberia. And looking at it now, I can kind of see why we used to call them the Tungus people. Because when our, I guess, Russian or Western anthropologists started to study them, quite some time ago now, we're talking about a long time ago, it must have been, from our Western miasmatic view of the world, it must be incredibly frustrating talking to them, actually, and trying to get information out of them, because Tungus is actually the Yakut word for the Evenki people. The Evenki people call themselves Evenk, which means people. So you can imagine the old Victorian anthropologist going along saying, oh, "Who are you? We're people." yeah, but who are you? Well, we're people, and they don't have that concept either. It's quite interesting, And they also call themselves obviously they are very, very animistic, and one of their spirits, the reindeer, Oron, they call them the Orochon. They call themselves the Orochon, and you can see the anthropologists. Oh, you're Orochon. That's a good name. Well, what does that mean? Well, we look after reindeer. And they and it's this totally different way of seeing the world. They don't traditionally feel the need to put themselves into a box. I mean, some people in the West say that need to put labels on things and put things into boxes comes from Plato. I don't know whether that's true or not. But one of the things that I felt when I started to understand animism, shamanism at a better level, one of the things I found is that I sort of look back on my old self and says, yeah, I really, really, really spent an awful lot of time putting things in boxes, and they don't, as you rightly said. So yeah, I think your summary was good. As we talked about last time, my view is that the animism is a hook into the natural world that is adaptive from an evolutionary perspective. And, if we didn't have it, we wouldn't be here. I think that's quite a different view of animism from the view that purports that animist people sit around believing that there are spirits in rocks, But yeah, so to cut a long story short, I thought your summary was okay.
Okay, so I really want to drive this concept of animism home a little more. So we want to talk about the Evenks because they're a great example of truly animistic people. But I want to quickly go over the various stages we find animistic tribes along the path to faith and belief, because we do see some weird shit or traditions out there, like genital mutilation, penis inversion, whipping ceremonies, neck rings, and lip plates, to name a few. Some which, and I may be showing my ignorance here, but some which don't have that much foundation or base in reality or nature to me. So, I mean, could you talk about that and why and how some of these different stages we find animistic people in, and why we find such diverse traditions?
Well, I think we have talked about it, really. As we said, shamans are very creative, imaginative people. And in any group of people, when a hierarchical power structure of some type starts to arise, even in hunter-gatherer societies, there can be something like that. There are kind of, in hunter-gatherer societies, it's not that there's no what we would call hierarchy at all. It's that the hierarchy is a very, very flat, gentle, gradual slope. And it tends not to be based on cultural status. It tends to be based on ability. You know, you go out with the hunters in an animistic community. One of those hunters is more experienced than all the other hunters, and he's better at hunting, and he gets a level of respect from the group based on that, based on his ability.
A different way of viewing hierarchy, isn't it? Because we're very much deferential, or we're trained to be deferential.
It's a different type of hierarchy. If you could take the opposite extreme, you know, you're in a kingdom somewhere, and you have a king, and that king's eldest son, he's going to be the next king, irrespective of any qualities he may or may not have, or, you know, it's that kind of, you know, maybe he'll be better than his father, maybe he'll be worse, you know, but the bottom line is that's like the exact opposite of what we're talking about, you know. And so and I you know, I'm not too keen on talking about martial arts, but very briefly, one of the things that's always frustrated me with martial arts is this idea of belts. I think at this point in my life, I think they're one of the most pointless inventions ever. I know that some people think they're good to motivate people, but I remember years ago when I used to teach karate and the belts thing, and no matter how well you do your examination structure, you always end up with somebody with a lower belt who is of a higher ability than somebody with a higher belt. There's no way around that other than get rid of the belts. And that's kind of in a microcosm, the problem with hierarchical societies and macrocosm. The issue when you move to pastoralism, which remember we're talking about animistic societies, most of the pastoralists, most of the animistic societies that we talk about these days, they are pastoralists, they are not hunter-gatherers. The Evenki people are quite interesting in that they're basically pastoralists during the summer and they're hunter-gatherers during the winter, which, you know, they're like 50% hunter-gatherers, you know. But that's way more than most people, you know, and as we've said, in pastoral societies, you know, your status starts to get measured over a period of time and how many cows you own or how many reindeer you own, or, you know, and you get a status and effectively wealth. It's a bit like the agricultural surplus, but on a smaller scale. And you get guys who have more reindeer or more elks or more, you know, cows or sheep or anything than the other guy. And, you know, you see this in the Old Testament with, you know, Abraham and, you know, those guys, they measured themselves, partly they measured their status based on how many animals they had, you know. And again, that's like in microcosm or on a smaller scale, that's like the start of this idea of the rise of kings, chiefs, all this kind of stuff, which is rather different, from the situation you get with social animals, you know, in a group of chimpanzees, especially if, you know, animals like chimpanzees that can be fairly aggressive, you'll get like an alpha male, baboons as well. You'll get like an alpha male who has access to more of the females than the lesser males, if you like. But that's not exactly the same thing as a chief, because it probably is the case that guy, that chimpanzee is more dangerous than the other ones in terms of if it comes to a confrontation. Whereas the idea of a chief is, what I'm saying is you'll never end up being, if you're weak and ineffectual, you'll never end up being an alpha male chimpanzee. Though having said that, I'd rather be a bonobo, you know. It's you know, and I aspire, you know, that we're very, very closely related to both of those groups of animals, and I aspire in the future, you know, if human beings want to move in a positive direction, I would really hope we move towards the bonobo model and away from the chimpanzee model. But that's a very different thing from a chief, you know, that this kind of a socially conditioned idea is invented, is imagined, that there is a box of the chief or the king, and into that we put up a special person, a supposedly special person. That's a very, very different thing. But as a matter of fact, when the buffer zone arises, pastoralists have a small buffer zone, agriculturalists have a big buffer zone, or give rise to a big buffer zone. They themselves may not have that buffer zone, but the people they work for do. Somebody ends up getting control of that extra stuff. The more animals than we need, they're not equally distributed. We got more animals than we need. They're not equally distributed. We've got more rice than we need. That's not equally distributed. Somebody somewhere gets control of that. That person, that becomes a form of power to them. And then they then start using the abilities of the shamans for, shall we say, purposes that they weren't initially designed for. The abilities of the shamans were initially designed to protect the group as a whole. And to nurture the group as a whole. Now we're using them to dominate the group, or to start to dominate the group. And in order to keep people in line, one of the things we start to invent is things like rites of passage, things that people have to go through in order to earn their place in our hierarchy. Self-mutilation. I would point out that even chimpanzees don't do that. So these are definitely things that we have invented through our miasma as our very modern human species, has developed. The groups of people who are involved in that kind of thing, in my opinion, that has come out of their exotericism. Not out of their animism. And my simple proof for that is virtually every least sophisticated animal on the planet has animism. But of all those animals, only one of those animals shows a deep interest in the miasma. And only one of those animals is involved in that kind of thing, genital mutilation and that type of thing. And it just so happens that out of those two categories, it's exactly the same animal we're talking about. There's no coincidence there. And it's not chicken and egg. It's definitely one leading to the other. So the people in these positions of power, they start to create rituals, rites of passage, ideas about social hierarchies, little boxes for people to fall into. And these kind of rituals, they are originally, unfortunately, invented by shamans, I guess. They continually reinforce the power of the people in control because everybody else has to do these things. It's a bit like kowtowing, isn't it? It's a bit like everybody has to do these things in order to fit in and not to be ostracized and not to be a social outcast. And to be honest, this is one of the ways that exoteric religions have done damage to animist groups over the years, including the Evenki, is a cultural, at a cultural level. They literally take their armies there and they'll kill them. That's one of the things exotericists have done historically. But also they will
method of stealth though as well.
Yeah, they will re-engineer their language, as happened in our own country. The language was re-engineered in order to, I suspect semi-deliberately, in order to reinforce our heavily exoteric culture and to suppress any remnants of the esotericism or the animism that predated that in the UK and other developed countries. So I think that one of the things I've been thinking about recently is we keep talking about the miasma, but we've never actually done a podcast specifically
I was thinking
on
the same thing.
miasma. So maybe that's something we should think about in the near future is do a podcast specifically on the miasma.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we'll decide when to do that. It might be the next episode or the one after that, or we'll see. Is there something biologically in us which facilitates this kind of hierarchy? Because, chimpanzees display it, but bonobos don't. So, and we're kind of related to both. I'm not a biologist. I'm not sure, but
well, there is. It's unfortunately, it's that I don't know if you've come across the concept of genes and memes. Genes being traits in a species that are chemically passed between the generations, and memes being things that are passed by other means, culture, for instance. And in our particular species, because we talked about our origins in the trees and the traits that we've developed, and then further developed as hunters, animals that hunt for a living, like human beings did and do. They tend to get quite, what we call intelligent, because they need to outsmart their prey. That's a It's a fact. Lions eat not just because they are faster than the things they're hunting, they're generally not, but because they're smarter than the things they're hunting. And when they close up with them, obviously they're more dangerous, and they've got the claws and teeth and stuff, So yes, there is something in us biologically that gave rise to this, but did it absolutely have to give rise to this? I don't know, because we went for so long without ever doing this exotericism thing, without ever doing the miasma thing. We went for 2 to 3 million years with seemingly the ability to do that. And yet we never actually did it until very, very recent times.
We, as in your definition of human.
Yeah.
As in not Homo sapiens, collectively.
So it's a very interesting question whether it was something that was inevitable. I suspect that it was. Could we have got another million years perhaps without doing it? That's also possible, But for whatever reason, it happened, and we are where we are, and we are way, genetically speaking, compared to probably any other animal on the planet, we are way out of our comfort zone. Talk about being out of your comfort zone. We are way, way out of our comfort zone, and what we've got is a massive mismatch between our genetics and our culture, our genes and our memes, if you like. And it's the impact of that on people like, I say the impact of that on the Evenki people, the impact of that on animistic peoples throughout the globe. I'm trying to think of animistic people who haven't been negatively impacted by our by our exotericism, but they did suffer. Give you a bit of background on them. They obviously they live in Siberia, and they've become famous because shamanism, the word shaman, they call their shamans shamans, so that's like, what's the Mongol word for shaman? That's bow. What's the Evenki word for shaman? Well, that's shaman. Yeah. So it's quite easy to remember. Yeah. And there's not a lot of them, they live in a huge, huge area. It's been greatly reduced over the years by Christian expansion. But today it's still about 1 million square miles of Siberia it's a very, very big area that they live in. But there's only about 35,000 of them. So you can see that they have a very, very low population density. The Yakut know them as the Tungus, as we said. The Mongols call them the Khamingan. And they are very well known to the other tribes. As I think I've said before, that the Evenki language is used by the Yakut and other tribes in Siberia, lesser known tribes, and also to a certain extent by the Mongols. Actually, a few Evenki live in Mongolia. And it's like a lingua franca for trade and for other things. They're very, very easygoing people. That doesn't mean they're not smart. They're much closer proximity to, historically speaking, they're in much closer proximity to the Christians than the Yakut, for instance. But they took a quite different, quite clever way of dealing with them that's actually quite similar in some ways to how the Chinese people have dealt with foreign invaders historically. For instance, Genghis Khan and his grandson Kublai. If I contrast them with the Yakut, when the Christian forces started expanding into their area, the Yakut, as we mentioned, they were quite resistant to the invasion, if you like, and they fought back. The Evenki, being, in some ways true animists, they incredibly cynically adopted Christianity or appeared to. And then basically they had these guys who used to stand lookout. And whenever the priests they saw priests approaching, they would run into their little chapel and all start praying.
Quick, get the crosses out.
And it was, they're quite clever and they had to be. They're quite clever in how they dealt with the Christians. The Christians.
I wonder, as animists, if they saw the Christians purely simply as a threat to them.
Oh, they knew they were a threat. These people are not stupid. They are not stupid people. They're very, very intelligent. Their way of life for an animistic people is actually quite complex. They are very technological in a animistic kind of way. I'll give you a couple of examples for that. They are, they call themselves, we look after reindeer, where their main animals are reindeer. And one of the things that bothers the reindeer, certainly during the summer months, is they have a real problem with biting insects, and they are almost plagued by them. They call them garmakta, which is probably another kind of indication of their animism. We kind of distinguish between gnats and midges and mosquitoes and all of that kind of thing. No, they're just garmakta. They bite you, they're unpleasant, they're garmakta. And so they developed this incredible technology of these smoke towers, which are quite clever constructs they make out of I think it's birch. They use birch wood, and they're like smokestacks that burn very, very slowly. They let off a lot of smoke, and but the smoke is not acrid. It's not unpleasant to the reindeer or to the humans, but it's really, really bad to the garmakta. It gets rid of them, basically. So as relief for their reindeer, they really, really care about their reindeer. We were talking about animists having a reverence for nature and a reverence for animals and animal spirits. Yeah. They are so close to their reindeer. We did that episode on the supposed domestication of the dog, and we said, human beings and dogs, we have this sort of long-term historical symbiosis. Well, with the Evenki, you have to substitute reindeer for dogs. They're very, very close to their reindeer, and they will not kill them. For instance, they will not kill them. They'll hunt wild reindeer, and they'll eat wild reindeer, and they'll hunt for the skins. But their own reindeer, it wouldn't even cross their mind. It's like killing a member of the family. They're also pretty much the only people on the planet, or one of the very few people on the planet, have figured out the fine art of riding reindeer. Which is quite an interesting thing, because most people who use reindeer for propulsion, they'll make a sledge or a sleigh and they'll put the reindeer on the front and they'll get pulled along. But they've developed this saddle, and they put the saddle over the shoulders of the reindeer, the front shoulders of the reindeer, rather than over the back of it like you would on a horse. And this reduces, because reindeer are relatively, they're not as strong as horses. It reduces the load on the animal, and they can ride these things. It looks quite interesting when you see them riding them. It's just quite interesting. They like I said, they use these smokestacks to keep the garmakta off their beloved reindeer, and themselves, clearly. But again, these things are created by shamans, they call this smoke sanyan. They call the smoke sanyan. It's almost like I was almost about to say it's almost like a magical smoke, Now let's stay off that word, shall we? It's a sanyan smoke, yeah. They're actually quite interesting. They're actually related reasonably distantly to the Manchu, the people who overthrew the last imperial dynasty, the Chinese native imperial dynasty, the Ming, and established the Qing dynasty, the final imperial dynasty in China. And their language is reasonably closely related to the Manchu people. They do, if you want to pick a people who embody animism, as we've said, they are lovely, lovely people, very easygoing. The way in which they dealt with the Christian expansion was very subtle. It wasn't just that that they, pretended to be Christians when the priests were around. It was altogether more complicated than that. They noticed, they sort of noted that the Christians had a, shall we say, a strong interest in money. And they realized that the skins of wild animals had a significant value, to the Christians. So they started selling them skins. So Christians coming in saying, you can see how well they dealt with it. We're going to kill you because you're heathens. No, we're not. We're Christians. Look at us all praying in the church. Yeah. Okay then. But you're on land we might want to use. We got this lovely furs that you might want to go back to Moscow or wherever and sell, in the markets, and make a fortune. Okay, then we won't kill you. That was kind of the way they dealt with them. I don't want to underplay the hardship that was imposed upon them. It was bad, but they did deal with the Christian forces much more cleverly than the Yakut did, and they initially, for a long time, they suffered somewhat less. The problem was that, greed, materialism, it has no, it's not easily satiated. So eventually they had this thing called a fur tax imposed on them, whereas rather than selling skins to the Christians, it was expected that they would produce skins for their Christian masters. And just to make sure that they didn't skimp on their fur tax, the Christians employed the Cossacks. The Cossacks are a group of Slavic peoples living in the far east of what would be Christian Russia. And they are Christians themselves. So, and they're very, very, at that time, they were very, very dangerous people. You don't want to mess with them. So they basically were taxed. The thing called the fur tax put an enormous burden on them, and actually changed their hunting patterns. They very like the San people who we talked about. They had a great reverence. They wouldn't kill young animals. They hunted animals for the things that they needed. They used to hunt things like elk and deer, that type of thing, and they. Famously, they would, if they killed a large animal, an elk or something like an elk, they would not leave it. They would not leave any kind of remains. They would use everything. They would use the skins. They would use the bones. They would eat the meat. That they have an abhorrence, or had an abhorrence of waste. The fur tax that was imposed upon them, that changed their hunting. They started hunting bears, sable, lynx, marmots, wolves, this type of thing. Anything where the pelt had a value, because they had to make up their quota. They had to make up their tax. And actually the fur tax became so burdensome that a lot of them actually dropped out of hunter gathering entirely. Incidentally, that they couldn't fulfill any of the fur tax from their own reindeer because they won't kill them. So they couldn't sell reindeer hides from their own reindeer. The reindeer are there for milk and for transportation only. They are not killed ever or eaten. So they had to do all this with hunting, and it just became too much. The tax went up and up and up, and it just became too much for them. So some of them actually ended up becoming farmers in the end. And it's not the greatest place to be a farmer, Siberia, certainly in those days. They used to use, for their hunting, they used to use bows and spears and a special big knife with a long handle, which was actually used, it's a heavy duty thing, actually used for defense against bears. Bears in that area being a very, very dangerous animal. But it was also useful because these people live in the taiga forests. They are boreal forests. They're lower than the Arctic Circle, but they're all like, pine, spruce, larch, those type of trees. And a lot of their life is actually conducted in these forests. And this long handle knife doubled as a way of cutting your way through the forest kind of thing. But then the Christians started giving them guns in the 17th century, so that they are very, very expert in shooting these days. And when they do their hunting, it's guns, it's not bows and arrows and spears and stuff. So there, you can see that although they're still very, very animistic, they are lots of spirit animals. All of the things we talked about in the Animism podcast, give you an idea that they have a maka who's their sort of a bear spirit, and there's Oron, we mentioned the reindeer, Kiran, the eagle, Kulin, snake. A really interesting one, Bagdavki, is a swan. They know about waterfowl because actually a lot of the areas where they live, they're around Lake Baikal and other lakes in central Siberia, so they are very, very familiar with water, that's like the center of their very large homeland. Well, but that was obviously, gradually eroded, and that hasn't stopped even today. There are still encroachments on their way of life, and they become ever more burdensome. But the fact that they've survived at all is a testament to the cleverness with which they deal with other peoples. And I think that came from the fact that they were central. They'd always dealt with other tribes in Siberia. And their shamanism is still very, very practical. I mean, I mentioned this smoke tower technology. They have lots of things like that. They're good at making like boats, canoes, all that kind of stuff, out of, they use bark of trees and this type of stuff. And they have a weird and wonderful variety of spirit animals, the lynxes I didn't mention, wolverines, and the foxes of, we mentioned the great goddess Inari, So they're pretty much.
I was going to say, does that play a major part in their shamanistic technique?
Yeah, of course.
The reindeer.
Of course. And they're proper animistic people, and still are. Although they're clever at dealing with other people, but the pressure on them has just gone up and up and up and up and up. They're clever in dealing with the Christians, but then they, after the Russian Revolution,
the Russians came and clobbered them then, didn't
they?
The
Soviets didn't treat them very well, frankly. And actually there was an uprising, in 1925. They actually, at long last, it's like the straw that broke the camel's back. They took on more and more burden. And in the end, they did uprise against the Soviets. But the problem was their numbers. So they were very clever. In guerrilla warfare, you wouldn't want to fight them. They know their territory, and it wasn't easy for the Soviets to put them down. But if you think that their population was at that time less than 50,000 people, that's their entire population, including children and women and what have you. The Red Army at that time was 500,000 soldiers. Yes. So there was just no way, no matter how clever they were. And so the Soviets put them down. And then even in modern times, there is a lot of corporate interest in the lands where they live, mineral prospecting and that type of thing. And of course, there are big companies with a lot of wealth and a lot of power want to move in on that land. And so even today, like contemporary news, if you look in the contemporary news about the Evenki people, you'll still see them being ever more burdened by the nation states, and the people, the stronger cultures that surround them. And they're still there, and they're still going. I was so impressed by the Evenki people, I have to say, that just the fact that they've survived, and they've kept, it's unbelievable what they've been through,
There must be very few animistic people out there who don't have that level of.
Yeah, and it never goes away. This is the problem, because, some nation states do every now and again come to a realization. This happened in the US, for instance. They come to a realization that, this our indigenous peoples are a treasure to us, and we want to protect them and help them to preserve their culture because it's a real treasure. But they usually come to that realization far too late. Yeah. It's always after the horse is bolted, and that certainly happened in the US far too late. And, but it does happen. And I'm not saying that there aren't people in Russia who don't see the indigenous peoples as a treasure of the nation. There certainly are, and probably in government there certainly are. But that, you know, the corporate interests and or exoteric religious interests, those people have power, and that power never goes away. And in some ways, it only ever increases. You know. So
what is it about exoteric religion that just has to put their ideas on other people and force people to convert? It's crazy.
Well, that's why it's successful, mate. Yeah, that's why it's successful. If they didn't, then they wouldn't be that successful, you know. But one of the things that's very interesting in terms of how the Evenki people dealt with outside, have always dealt with outside people in such a clever way. Was one of my teachers, my guides, the one who I've been the closest to. More than 20 years now, she's been my guide and still is. And you've met her.
I think I know what you're talking about. She's really nice.
Yeah. We sat down having a cup of tea one day, and she said to me, we were talking about another one of my guides, who's actually been very, very successful in the world of business. He's a very, I wouldn't say which company, but a very, very high-ranking manager, senior manager director in one of the world's biggest companies. We were talking about how he'd achieved that, and she said to me, "There's a cup of tea and like a napkin on the table," and she says, "Stupid managers try to move people like this." And she took the cup of tea and she put the napkin on the top, and she moved the napkin round on the top of the cup of tea. And of course, the cup of tea didn't move. That was trying to move the cup of tea from above, right? From putting yourself above them. And the one of my teachers she was talking about, he says, he moves people like this. And she picked the tea up and she put it on top of the napkin. And then she pulled the napkin and the cup of tea moved with the napkin. And that was her way of explaining how he'd been so successful in what outsiders would see as managing people. And you can see that sort of analogy in some of the stories out the Bible. You know, Jesus washing the feet of his disciples is probably not the most obvious thing for the founder of one of the world's major religions to be doing. You know, but it's the same kind of idea. You know, to move people from underneath, not to put yourself above them. And this is basically what the Evenki have done historically with, you know, first of all the Christians, and then the Soviets, and then more recent years corporate interests. This is how they've dealt with them, and like I said, it's against impossible odds. They're still there. They're still shamanistic. They're still animistic, and they're still really lovely people. Incidentally, their spirit dance is awesome. Just awesome. So lively. I think it comes as a shock because, you know, as Westerners, we think spirit dance has to be, you know, raw religious things. It must be austere and boring and, you know, just the opposite. It is wonderful. So yeah, they're very, very special people. And they, you know, for those of us in the West, we owe them a debt of gratitude, if for nothing else, is they crystallized this idea. They gave us this word shaman. They allowed us to even know that this thing existed in the first place. Because to be honest, before we got that word, we probably didn't, you know. So, you know, bless them. You know, that's what I say about the Evenki people. Sorry,
could you talk? Yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Evenki people and their shamanism. Well, they rather than animism, you know. Yeah,
it's both shamanism and animism. The other thing they're incredibly famous for is their shamans, obviously, and they historically they've had what I've seen have been incredible. Some of the most powerful shamans have come from among the Evenki people. One of the funny stories is funny from a Westerner's point of view is the what's known as the Tunguska event, which was a huge meteorite or comet that burst in the atmosphere in 1908. Over a large part of the Evenki lands, and it scientists have estimated it's hard to estimate the size of this blast, but they've estimated that it was somewhere between 5 and 30 megatons. Now, if you think that the Hiroshima bomb was around 15 kilotons, this thing was almost certainly at least 10, possibly 100, times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb, yeah? And it leveled an enormous area of Evenki, the taiga forest that I was talking about, the boreal forest. And what's very, very interesting about their shamanism stroke animism is they have a concept of a spirit called Agda, who is the spirit of thunder, or the spirit of things that go bang. Yeah. And so it's very, very interesting to see the indignation of Western scholars over their explanation of the Tunguska event. Oh, it was the spirit of thunder, Agda, that caused this thing, Incidentally, there's another story. This is rather more mythical, and I don't know if it's humorous or not. But there was within the Evenki people, there were different family groups, and a very powerful black shaman got really annoyed with a different family group one day and set off this 30 megaton explosion. But perhaps not. But in terms of that thing with the spirit of thunder, causing that really shows you the difference between Westerners and animists. It sounds ludicrous to a Western scientist who knows better in inverted commas, that something that was caused by a meteorite striking the atmosphere and exploding in a huge explosion. I think there was about 2,000 square kilometers of forest flattened, something like that. Yeah. They obviously they know better and they say it was a meteorite and all this kind of stuff. And obviously these ignorant Evenki people, they believe in this spirit of thunder, and they believe that the spirit of thunder caused that, where we know better. But it sort of shows their ignorance, because again, this is the Western word spirit. They think that these people sit around believing things, and they absolutely don't. What they mean by the Agda, the spirit of thunder, is that nature, that aspect of nature, that aspect of the underlying spirit of nature that gives rise to energy changes that can be very explosive, caused that event. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's what they think. But the Western people, we think that they sit around believing that this god, Agda, who's exactly the same as what we call a god, did it. Yeah. And so really they have because they're much closer to nature than us, they still hunt, they still live off hunting half the year at least. And they understand that in nature there can be powerful energy changes, and that's what they call those energy changes, Agda, and there's nothing supernatural about their belief at all. It's not really a belief, yeah? It's just part of what they are. It's us that creates this idea of the god, in inverted commas, of thunder, because we, frankly, invented this god idea, we collectively, the exotericists. And they, in terms of their shamanism, they, as I said, they're foragers in these taiga forests, and they live an animist lifestyle. Remember a long time ago when we were talking about the role of the shaman, and maybe in the first episode, I don't know, it was a very early episode, and I said, a shaman's the sort of guy who would say things like, where should we go in the winter in order to survive the winter? Where should we go in the summer? And the shamans, being the leaders, the strategic leaders from the group, with the Evenki, they came up with a very, very practical solution to the where they live. They live in Siberia, right? In the winter, it's cold, right? It's really cold, yeah? But in the summer, it can be quite warm, they have this problem with mosquitoes and stuff like that, And so how do you organize your tribe? Because in the winter, that you, in the summer, you want to take advantage of the warmth and the fact that you have these wonderful rivers. You can make your camps along the banks of the rivers and Lake Baikal and the lakes, and you can do fishing, and you go out on boats, and you can have a very rich lifestyle. You can increase your reindeer herds. You can concentrate on livestock rearing. They take milk from the reindeer. They have a summer's bounty, but then in the winter, and you can gather food, wild food, and all sorts of. But then in the winter, totally different. There's nothing you can eat except animals that you go out and kill. You've got to become hunter-gatherers again in the winter. But as we've said, pastoral societies, which they are in the summer, can support much larger populations than hunter-gatherer societies, which they are in the winter. So how do they get around that? Well, their shamans manage that. Their shamans manage that in a very clever system. Their encampments, they break up. In the winter, they live in encampments they live in these sort of conical huts. They look a bit like sort of North American teepees. They're not like the Mongol ghats. They're more of a conical shape. Can be quite big. But they live in encampments of about 2 of those tents in the winter. But come the summer, they live in encampments of about 10. And so the shamans have worked out the ideal ratio of how to split up the groups and then bring them back together again to get the most out of the natural environment, the very extreme natural environment they live in, with the incredibly cold and sparse winters when they must become hunter-gatherers, and these warm summers when there's a lot of other activities they can do, a lot of other food-generating activities they can do. And that's shamanism. You can see shamanism at work there. The shamans have organized that, obviously based on their understanding of nature. They haven't thought, they didn't think they were hunter-gatherers, and they didn't think they were pastoralists. The shamans have understood over the generations through nature, through their close interaction with nature, they've understood the best way to organize those people. And I'll bet you, if you make some sort of computer algorithm that sorts out what the best number of tents in an encampment is in the summer and winter, I'll bet you that will come up with the optimal number being 10 in the summer and 2 in the winter. So there's an example of something they've done with their shamanism.
Fantastic. I'm just sat here quite enjoying your talk this episode, to be honest. It's kind of
one of the other things to say is, we talked about black shamans, and they have some of those that become haptaj. Yeah, they have some of those as well. But let's not talk about those guys. Yeah, maybe they.
Go on, Damon.
No, all I would say is that that everything you hear about shamanism, everything you hear about animism, it's there with in abundance among the Evenki people, in absolute abundance. I don't think there's anything that we've talked about on any of the podcasts to date that you wouldn't find going on somewhere in their society. That's probably the best way to put it.
Fantastic. All right. So to wrap this podcast up, then I think we're pretty much done. One last thing. Can you? Because you've mentioned. Regressed hunter-gatherers, you've mentioned hunter-gatherers, you've mentioned pastoral societies, and I know it's not our wish on these podcasts to put labels and stages on things, but I thought it might be interesting for you to just sort of from hunter-gatherer stage to becoming exoteric, what those stages are, because you've described them a few times, so it'd be interesting to just put that in an order of what they're called.
Briefly, because I think that's another podcast, but briefly, I'll give you a slightly humorous, maybe I've said this before, I don't know, but there's an idea how this stuff arises. I don't know what you call those stages. This is we'd have to come up with words for them, because this is not the kind of thing, interestingly, although it's the source of all of our lives. It doesn't seem to be something that many people have studied. I've studied it a reasonable amount. Here's a kind of slightly humorous example. So you're a hunter-gatherer people, you're having fun, you're out hunting, and then you sit around the campfire, you're having you're telling your stories, practicing your shamanism, doing your spirit dance, whatever, banging your drum, whatever you want to do, and then your shaman comes back. He says, I've been out there down by the river, And I couldn't help noticing, this wild grass that grows around here. I couldn't help noticing if it sort of seems to grow really well in that mud that the river washes over the banks every year. And so what I did was last year I stuck some seeds of that stuff into the ground. And guess what? There's loads of the stuff come up, We're got a bounty, And they were like, "Oh, that's great. You're a brilliant shaman. You are a great, powerful shaman. We love you." Yeah. And then he says, I couldn't help noticing, on another occasion, if we grind this stuff between two rocks, it turns into a powder, and then I mixed it with water and I tried different things, but then I tried sticking it in the fire. It turns into this amazing bread stuff. You don't know what you call it, this amazing bread. So it's, we can feed our faces, guys. Yeah. So you see the Toshiltina, the shaman going on there. He's playing. Yeah. He's just playing. He's not thinking, oh my God, there are going to be implications of this when somebody gets control. We now got all this bounty. We've got way more food than we know what to do with. What he's thinking is, I'm here to nurture my tribe. I'm here to help my tribe. We're going to distribute this equally like we do everything else. I'm here to help you guys. Yeah. What he doesn't realize is among the people he's speaking to, there's one guy sat there thinking, or girl sat there thinking, maybe I want a bit more of that than the rest get. And that was the start. That was the spark of what we've done. So the stage from there is that person maneuvers themselves until they get control of the excess, and then they start to dominate the other people within their growing society, because now we got more food, we can support a larger population. They start to say, well, you can have some of this stuff some of this food if you do X, Y, and Z for me. And then you've got we got the shaman guy though. He's a bit of a problem, that guy, because he's a bit of a spanner in the works. I tell you what, I'll buy him out. I'll get him thinking of things he can do in order to make these people easier for me to control. Again, subconscious. Not necessarily they're thinking through this stuff consciously. Maybe some of them were, some of them weren't. But in those early societies, and Genghis Khan we've talked about a few times. He's the most classic example. Everybody's heard of Genghis Khan, but very few people have heard of Tep Tenger. Tep Tenger was the shaman who propelled Genghis Khan to power. Genghis Khan didn't treat him very well in the end, but he was the shaman who propelled Genghis Khan to power. And in some Western countries they say behind every powerful man is a powerful lady. Yeah. Well, actually, in those days it was behind every powerful leader, male or female, there was a powerful shaman, male or female. And a lot of people don't know that the world's biggest empire, the Mongol Empire, was built off the back of a shaman. Tep Tengri, a great shaman, great Mongol shaman, who was, some would say one of the most powerful shamans of all time. Clearly, he could demonstrate that he could walk the walk, not just talk the talk. Otherwise, the Mongol Empire wouldn't have been so big. But yeah, so that's kind of the sequence. That's how it goes. Maybe I think it's another one for a podcast. Could we come up with words for those different stages? So that sort of moral thing, I've got an idea, right? For instance, we talked about this before. We'll create this, that God, the great bear spirit. If this was the Evenki didn't do this, bless them. But if they had, the Amaka, the bear spirit, let's just say, right? I'll write this book for you. Let's just say that you're descended from the bear spirit, that the leader spirit of our people. And let's get people believing that you're descended from the bear spirit. And then they're going to think, yeah, this guy's our boss. And we're so proud of him because he's descended from the bear spirit, and everything that we have, all our prosperity, all the good things that happen to us come from him. I really want to help this guy out. I have loyalty to him. I have patriotism to him, start to get this idea of nation states, which also didn't exist incidentally in those days. And you can see how it progresses, and it goes on and on and on. And not to belittle it, exotericism became incredibly good, not to be underestimated at manipulating human populations. So I don't want to do exotericism a disservice in terms of its sophistication. It has become, certainly in the model world, incredibly sophisticated in terms of its role as a population stabilizer. The problem is, of course, we have conflicting population stabilizers running around in the world. That's the real problem with it.
Mm. I was wondering as well, maybe this is for another podcast, going back to the Evenki people and their shamanism, if there's any specific shamanic exercise that you know of from that region.
Yeah, there are, but again, I don't want to go into this on this podcast. We can do that. But we've given out a bunch of exercises so far, and it's really, I don't want to. Most of the exercises that I would like to talk about, I have a kind of progression in mind for exercises for these podcasts. Most of the exercises that I've given out so far, I'm pretty much done with what I want to give out before we talked about Amskar, the breath. Once we've done that, there'll be lots and lots. So just watch this space. That's my
watch this space.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, that's about it. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Head over to www.wovenenergy.com. You can grab yourself an exclusive episode that we've filmed. It's only available for those that sign up to the email list and keep in touch with us. So head over there, sign up. Any questions you have, just send them over to joe@wovenenergy.com. That's joe@wovenenergy.com. I'll get them answered for you on the many Q&A sessions that are going to be coming up. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Joe.
Cool.